In the history of United States, there have been many revolutionary protests. The era of 1960s and 1970s was built upon protests and movement that changed the American society forever. The major protests from this era was the Civil Rights Movement, the Vietnam Anti-War Movement, and lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender movement. All these movements shared a common goal. People taking part in these protests were striving to gain identity and equality. These people fought for equal job opportunities, equal educational opportunities, and just basic human rights. For African Americans, Mexicans, and many other minority groups, rigid segregation ruled throughout the country. In southern states, African Americans were segregated for jobs, education, and housing by law. Due to the harsh education and housing circumstances, half of the African American society lived under poverty. Their schools were segregated, the housing was segregated, even their water fountains and seats on the buses were segregated. Even though slavery ended, African American lifestyle did not get much better. Because of their skin color, African Americans did not have the same rights as white people. After the Civil War, slavery ended and African Americans did get the right to vote and became citizens of the United States. However, these new laws were often ignored because of so much prejudice in the community. They were treated as second-class citizens. This injustice on African Americans led to a time of social unrest. In 1950s and 1960s, blacks rose up to fight against the social system. The public authorities that had taken these rights away from them had to answer for their actions. Association for the Advancement of Colored People became one of the largest and most influential organizations in the United States. The organization was formed in response to horrific practice of lynching and other race riots. The organization worked to remove barriers of racial discrimination. The Supreme Court case of Brown versus Board of Education sparked the civil rights movement. In 1954, ruling of Brown versus Board of Education dramatically changed the American society. The case unanimously held that racial segregation of children in public schools was unconstitutional. It overturned Plessy versus Ferguson that gave separate but equal rights to minorities. The first major civil rights revolution was observed when Eisenhower sent federal troops to escort 9 students into the schools. Whites had a really hard time adjusting to the fact that schools were no longer segregated and their children have to share schools with African Americans. The modern civil rights movement began in the 1950s when an African American woman named Rosa Parks refused to give a seat on the bus to a white man. For this protest, Rosa Parks was arrested. Blacks had no longer wanted to sit in the back of the bus. They started to boycott and they started protests, which were led by a young minister named Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther King Jr. encouraged people to stand up against injustice and to protest for their civil rights. He was a great spokesperson who spoke out on the radio and television programs and inspired many African Americans to take part in nonviolent protests. Dr. King and thousands of other protesters were put into prison for standing up against the system. His famous letter for Birmingham stated, "Individuals have a moral duty to disobey unjust laws. All segregation statuses are unjust because segregation distorts the soul and damages the personality. It gives the segregator a false sense of superiority and segregated a false sense of inferiority. The modern African American civil rights movement, like similar movements earlier, transformed the American democracy. It also served as a model for other group advancement and other group pride efforts involving women, students, Chicanos, gays, lesbian, elderly, and many others. The movement against U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War began small among some peace activists and some students at college campus, but soon grew to a national prominence. Anti-war marches and other protests, such as the ones organized by college students, grew larger and more powerful. Media played a crucial role in providing momentum for the anti-war movement. It covered protest demonstrations and sit-ins conducted by the groups that were opposed to Vietnam War. Songwriters and lyricists used the power of music to represent their opinion about the war. Protest singers like Bob Dylan, Barry McGuire, and Tom Paxton inspired young people with their musical masterpieces. Political protest songs covered all kinds of protest issues and inspired many to take a stand against the unjust systems. Stimulated by the protest and anti-war movement, the LGBT community also took steps to demand for equality. Their movement started in response to persecution and investigation of gays and lesbians. They wanted to be recognized and be included in the American society. The LGBT community fought through rallies, sit-ins, and boycotts. 1960s was a time of social upheaval in United States. Revolutions and countercultures influenced the changes in the American system, and it attained equality for many minority groups.